Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, we now know the roadmap. There is light at the end of the tunnel. If all goes well, by June the 21st, we will be out of lockdowns. I expect there are things you are yearning to do. I'm yearning to see my dad in his care home, to go for long walks that end up with a pub lunch, to invite people for dinner and sit at table with friends. I've never really thought of myself as a travel addict particularly, but I'm also yearning to go abroad, to hear people chatting in other languages, to see places I've never been before. And I'm yearning to worship in other languages. I love going to church in France and praying in French. One of the places I am missing most is the little Burgundy village of Thésée, perched on a hill a few miles east of Cluny. I first went there when I was 17 and have been most, if not quite every year since. It's the home of an ecumenical monastic community where thousands of young people gather over the summer months. I'm excited that Claire, our college chaplain, and Dirk, an academic in chemistry and next year's senior academic here at Christ Church, have agreed to come with me and a group of students on a chaplaincy pilgrimage in June 2022. When I am at Thésée, I maintain my discipline of celebrating Mass, the Eucharist, every day by concelebrating with one of the monks in the little crypt chapel under the main community church. The chapel is full of icons and very beautiful. In the corridor outside, there is a stunning stained glass window. It's tall and narrow, and this canvas behind me this morning is a photo of just the lower half of it. It's an image of a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, and you can just see the adult hands touching his shoulders and his own hand touching the hand on his left side. If you could see the whole window, you'd see that the man behind him is an old man. The window, made by one of the brothers of the community at Thésée, portrays a story in Genesis 22. It's a searing and heartbreaking story. And even though I have this canvas on the wall in my cellar chapel here at Christ Church, I can hardly bear to look at it. The boy is Isaac, and the man is his father, Abraham. The story in Genesis 22 is the account of God asking Abraham to take his son, his first and most beloved son, up a mountain and slaughter him, to kill him as a sacrifice. Looking at this picture, this stained glass, the trust on Isaac's face for his father is total. His faith in him is total. His eyes look up, secure in the knowledge that his father will care for him. Genesis 22 is one of the most powerful passages among many in the Hebrew Scriptures. Jews today read this account on the High Holy Days, the days of awe, the Day of Atonement, and the New Year, each autumn. In our first reading today, St. Paul reflects on the Abraham cycle of stories. The letter to the Romans, where our first reading comes from, is notoriously complex, and Paul's argument sometimes difficult to follow or understand. It's particularly hard for us to follow when we get snippets like today's passage, which really make no sense at all without the larger context, the whole argument. And it's even harder to understand because our minds are full of the arguments of history. Our reading of St. Paul is overlaid with thoughts about faith and works that owe more to the 16th century Reformation than to 1st century Judaism, or even the time when Abraham actually lived. And it's hard for us to lay aside centuries of Christian anti-Semitism that make us think of the superior Christian grace taking over the supposed inferior Jewish law. Romans 4 is a key passage in Paul's letter, and almost all of the commentaries will point you to Genesis 15 as the key text on which Paul is commenting. They do so because Paul is clearly reflecting on the promise made to Avram, as he still was, that his seed would be many, that Abraham, as he becomes, would be the father of many nations. However, I want you to think of this picture of Isaac as vital to understanding Paul's viewpoint. Paul was clearly familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, almost certainly in the Greek version of them. He would be familiar with what we know as Genesis 15 of Genesis, the covenant God makes with Abraham. But Genesis 15 is hardly the most memorable, the most colourful, let alone the most dramatic of the stories of Abraham. The covenant is in some ways an important linchpin in the story, but it is not the heart of who Abraham is, and tells us very little about Abraham's character or history. I think that the whole of that character, all of that history, would have been in Paul's mind as he wrote his letter and as he reflects on Abraham, and as he does in today's first reading. Abraham is fascinating because in Genesis 12 he leaves his homeland, his family, his community behind. He leaves everything. In his travels he meets the otherwise unknown Melchizedek, a king and a priest without lineage. God makes this covenant with Abraham that his descendants will be as many as the stars of heaven, and then God asks that Abraham sacrifice his son, presumably necessary to make that happen. And Abraham obeys. He takes a knife, wood to burn the body of his son on, and goes up the mountain of Moriah. Only at the very last minute, when the sacrifice, the son, is prepared, does God intervene. Puzzlingly, St. Paul doesn't make much of the obvious parallels between Isaac and Jesus, an innocent victim to be offered by the Father. Later Christians have made much of that. But I think Paul is much more concerned with Abraham as the image of the true believer, whose faith is absolute trust in, abandonment to God. Paul must surely have known what we call the Lord's Prayer, the remarkably simple 7-clause prayer that Jesus taught his disciples when they asked him to teach them how to pray. Again, it's so familiar to us that it's hard for us to read it as if for the first time. And it's a particular clause I want to think of today, one that challenges me every time, the many times I pray it. Thy will be done. It challenges me because I don't think I really mean it. Just think about how extraordinary it is. We spend our whole lives making plans, making sure we are in control of things, and then we pray, thy will be done. We pray it, but we don't mean it. We get ourselves worked up for job interviews. We pray thy will be done, but mean, God, make sure I get this job. Abraham really meant it. If God's will meant leaving home and everything he knew, he did it. If God's will meant killing his beloved son, he would do it. As I said, I'm missing worshipping in French, so I've been using some French in my prayers recently. One of my favourite French prayers is by Blessed Charles de Foucauld, a hermit priest who died early in the 20th century and will soon be formally named as a saint. The prayer begins, Mon Père, je m'adonne à toi. Look it up on Google, there's some lovely musical settings of it. My Father, I abandon myself to you. It's an impossibly hard prayer to really mean. Here's the whole prayer. In English, I won't slaughter the French language this morning. I can see relief on the faces of my colleagues already. Father, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will. Whatever you may do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. Let only your will be done in me. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart, for I love you, Lord, and so need to give myself, to surrender myself into your hands without reserve and with boundless confidence, for you are my Father. An impossibly hard prayer to mean. But really, all it does is extend that clause of the Lord's Prayer that we pray so often. Thy will be done. That is Paul's faith. That is Abraham's faith. Total abandonment to the divine will. This picture of Isaac reminds us of nothing more, but nothing less than all the crosses and crucifixes in this building. It's the sign of abandonment, the sign of giving ourselves totally and utterly to God. And this is the heart of the Christian faith. This is what Paul understands. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Forget sterile arguments about faith versus works. Paul's understanding of Abraham is utterly simple as the faith of a child putting his hand into his father's. Into your hands I commend my spirit, my life, my all. I abandon myself.